Hi everyone, I hope this finds you well. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about synthesizing percussive sounds. So to do that, we're going to talk about some characteristics of percussion sounds and then how we can recreate those in VCV Rack or with other synthesizers. We're going to talk about ADAR envelopes. We'll also look at some drum synthesizers, which are modules which are specifically designed to create percussive sounds, though we'll also be looking at creating percussive sounds with our basic fundamental modules. And then we'll look at sequencing drum sounds and sequencing drum beats, which we do a little bit differently than we're working with pitched material. We'll use things like gate sequencers and things like that. And then to end the lesson, we're going to turn and talk about the TR-808, which is a really historically significant drum synthesizer. We'll look at the history of the instrument. We'll talk about some of the listening assignments, which are centered around pieces that use the 808. And then we'll end by recreating some 808 sounds in VCV Rack. So to start with, let's go over some basic characteristics of percussion sounds, like what makes percussion sounds different from, say, wind or string sounds. So percussion sounds often consist of two elements, and these two elements are pitch and noise. So whenever you hit a drum, whenever we're talking about percussion instruments, we're generally thinking about a drum, though there's often other kinds of percussion instruments that are made from metal or wood or things like that. But if we're thinking about drums in particular, we're going to have two elements, pitch and noise. The pitch is going to come from the resonating drum head, the actual part that we hit on the drum. That's going to resonate and produce a pitched sound. Now that pitched sound may be harmonic, that is, it might have a single coherent pitch, or it might be inharmonic. It might be a little denser. It might be more than one pitch ringing, but it'll generally be pitched sounds that are coming from that drum head. In addition, there's going to be noise, and that noise is going to come from the striking implement hitting the head. So whenever a hand or a drumstick or some other kind of mallet hits a drum, that moment of impact is going to create a noisy sound, a burst of noise. And the overall drum sound consists of a combination of these two sounds, of the noise from the striking implement hitting the head, and then the pitch from the head itself resonating. Now, this is a very broad summary of percussive sounds. So there might be some percussive sounds that produce just pitch. There's not really any noisy element, like a cowbell or striking a metal pipe or something like that. And there might be some sounds that produce mostly noise or almost entirely noise, like a snare drum. There's very little pitched element in a snare drum. So different drum sounds are going to consist of more or less pitch or noise, and that we can think of the balance between these as being on a spectrum. Another thing that differentiates percussion sounds is the envelope. And there's two envelopes that are really consequential with percussion sounds. One is the amplitude and one is the pitch. So with amplitude, we know that we're going to have an instantaneous attack. Whenever you strike a drum, the sound is going to happen immediately. We're not going to fade in. There's not going to be a slow attack. It's going to be instantaneous. And then there's going to be a generally pretty quick decay and release. You strike the sound, it's loudest at the beginning, and then it fades out, and it fades out pretty quickly generally. There's a similar envelope which is going to affect the pitch. And this is especially when we're talking about drums, less so if we're talking about striking metal implements like a cowbell or something. But if we're talking about drums, we'll very often have a pitch envelope where the pitch is going to descend on the decay or release. And this is due to the relaxing of the tension of the drum head. So if we look at this little picture of a drum on the slide there, the drum head, which is the part on top, is comparatively relaxed to when it's being struck. It's still pulled pretty taut. There's tension there. But the moment that in this case, the mallet, it strikes that drum, it's going to push that drum head down ever so slightly. And in pushing that head down, it's going to increase the tension on that drum head, and whatever pitch that drum head produces would be made very high. And then as the drumstick pulls away, and the drum head is allowed to relax and go back to its resting state, that pitch is going to get lower. And so a lot of drum sounds have a very quick, it's not like it takes a long time for this to happen, but very quickly this pitch is going to come down. And so we get these pitch envelopes that sound like doo, 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 that start high and then come down. Let's listen to a couple examples. So we're going to look at how to create such pitch envelopes in VCV Rack here in just a sec. But first, let's talk about some of the common drum sounds that we're going to be working with today. I know most of you guys are already familiar with this, but some of our most common drum sounds are kick drums or bass drums, snare drums, and hi-hat. And just to make sure everybody's on board here, a kick drum is a large drum that's usually the center of a trap set or a drum set that's played with a foot pedal, hence the term kick drum. You don't actually kick it, but you step on this foot pedal, and it produces a very big but low tone. A snare drum is a smaller drum, and it has these stiff wires pulled pretty tautly against the lower skin of the drum. These wires are called snares, and as a result of these snares, it produces a very sharp, short, noisy sound, and these snares help it be effectively a burst of white noise. And then lastly, there's a hi-hat. A hi-hat is a pair of cymbals mounted on a stand, and there's also a pedal that controls this and allows these cymbals to open and close, creating sounds with longer and shorter decays. If the hi-hat is closed, the cymbals are pressed up against each other, and there's virtually no decay. You get a very, very short sound, and as the cymbals are pulled further and further apart, as the hi-hat opens, there's a longer and longer decay, a longer resonance, as these cymbals are allowed to have a little more space to vibrate. Some other common drum sounds, I won't go into defining all these, but some other sounds you might find in a percussion setup might include a crash cymbal, which is a cymbal which is usually hit pretty hard and allowed to resonate for a while. Tom-toms, which are usually a collection of different drums. There might be 2, 3, or 4 of them, each of which will produce different pitches. Bongos, I'm sure you guys are familiar with. Hand claps, which is not really a drum, but is a sound that's often used on drum machines. Claves, which are a pair of sticks used in Latin percussion setups, which you see on the slide there. You just bang those sticks together. And then cowbells, which are also pictured on the slide, which produce these inharmonic and very short bell-like sounds. One important thing to think about as we're talking about synthesizing percussion sounds is that not all synthesized percussive sounds need to imitate actual acoustic percussion instruments. We can create all kinds of drums that maybe couldn't even exist in the real world. They might still behave similarly to drums, but they might sound different than any drum that we could actually build in the physical world. So that's important. We're not necessarily just doing what we're doing today to imitate acoustic instruments, but we're creating our own percussion sounds. And one thing to think about is the difference between imitating the sound of an acoustic drum and then imitating the function of an acoustic drum. So we can make something that functions like a kick drum and something that functions like a snare drum. And when I say function, I mean they play the same musical role. Like the kick drum might hit every quarter note beat 4 on the floor, and the snare drum might hit beats 2 and 4. But our synthesized kick drum might not sound anything like a real bass drum, and our snare drum might sound way noisier and way stranger than any actual physical acoustic snare drum. So there's a difference between imitating the sound of the drum and then imitating its musical function, or creating something that can fulfill its musical function. So before we start actually creating some of these sounds in VCV Rack, let's talk about the envelopes a little bit more, because percussion envelope sounds work a little bit differently. So because percussion sounds rarely sustain in the same way that wind and string instruments do, we can often get away with using simpler envelope generators. We don't need a full ADSR envelope. We can get away with an ADAR envelope. And ADAR envelopes are 2 different kinds of envelopes, but we use that term to refer to this category of these simpler envelopes. And then we'll look at 3 of them. We'll look at AD envelopes, attack decay, AR, attack release, and AHD, or attack hold decay envelopes. Let's start with the first one. So an AD, attack decay envelope, is what you might imagine. It's like an ADSR envelope, except it has no sustain and no release. And when I say no sustain, I literally mean it's as if the sustain knob were turned to 0. There is no sustain. So whenever an AD envelope gets a trigger, the voltage is going to increase to the maximum during the attack. If the attack is 0, it'll be instantaneous. If the attack is greater than 0, it'll take time to fade in. And then once it reaches the maximum, it's going to immediately decrease to 0 during the decay. What's important about an AD envelope is that it makes no distinction between receiving a gate or a trigger. It can't tell the difference. Whenever it gets a gate or a trigger, it's going to run through its AD cycle, and it's not going to behave differently either way. And so at the bottom of the slide there's 2 drawings of 2 different envelopes we might get with an AD envelope. The first one has a very quick attack time and then a slightly slower decay time. This is the kind of envelope we might use with a drum sound. And then on the right, there's just a triangle-shaped envelope that fades in during the attack and fades out during the decay. This is not anything we would use for a percussion sound, because usually we want a very quick attack, but this is something that we might use if we're using an AD envelope with, say, a pitched sound or something. So an AR envelope is very similar, but ever so slightly different. So an AR envelope has no decay stage. It technically does have a sustain stage, and so some AR envelopes are even called ASR because they just lack the decay. There is some kind of sustain involved. So in an AR envelope, the voltage increases to the maximum during the attack, and it's going to sustain at the maximum value for the duration of the gate, and then decrease back down to 0 during the release. And if you remember, we actually worked with an AR envelope before on the MS-20. The MS-20's EG1 was an AR envelope. It had an attack time, it would sustain for as long as your finger was on the key, and then it had a release time, but it didn't have a sustain level for us to adjust, and it didn't have a decay time to go down to that sustain level. We were always just sustaining at the full maximum value. So AR envelopes do distinguish between gates and triggers because gates will give it sustain time. If it gets a trigger, it's just going to start the attack immediately, and then whenever that trigger ends, which is instantly, it'll start the release. So if you're working with an AR envelope and you send it a trigger and it's got a long attack time, it won't have time to fade in. It's going to just start the release right away. And so you'll have to be careful if you're working with a clock that sends triggers to an AR envelope, because if you want anything more than an instantaneous attack, that's not going to work. But AR envelopes do like gates, because gates will give it some sustain time. It'll give it some time that it can fade in for an attack if you want to do that. Or even if you don't, if you're working with a percussion sound that has an instantaneous attack, it'll sustain for however long the gate is before it starts that release. And so on the slide there are a couple examples of some envelopes we might get with an AR envelope. The first one is very similar to what we saw with the AD envelope, except this would be if the AR envelope receives a trigger. It would just have an instantaneous attack, and then it would start the release right away. But on the right is what we might get if we sent to the AR envelope a gate, where it would have a quick attack, sustain for the length of the gate, and then start the release. So usually an AD envelope is going to be more useful for us because a lot of drum sequencers send triggers instead of gates. So we'll most likely be using ADs instead of ARs, but we'll look at some examples today that use both. So the last kind, though, is an AHD envelope, which is an attack decay envelope that has this added hold stage. And the reason we use this is sometimes an AD envelope doesn't provide enough sustain time, so we want a sound that has a little more length to it, a little more body to it. But if the sequencer is only sending triggers, we won't have any sustain time, so it's not like we could use an AR envelope. So we can just use the AD envelope, but have this hold time in the middle that's going to increase the sustain time. So even if it's just receiving a trigger, it'll receive the trigger and then hold for a while before that decay time starts. This is effectively like the hold time that we used on the MS-20 earlier this semester. If you remember, EG2 had that hold time. It does the same thing. It keeps the sustain going for a little bit even after the trigger ends, and then it starts the decay. One last thing to say about these envelopes is due to its reliance on sequencers over keyboards, West Coast synthesis commonly uses AD/AR envelopes for pitched sounds as much as they do for percussive sounds. So if you ever listen to music made on the Buchla synthesizer, like for instance, a lot of the sounds that we heard in Silver Apples of the Moon, a lot of those sounds were produced using these very simple envelopes, attack decay envelopes. So on the slide there, you can see an AD module on a Buchla synthesizer. So let's go ahead and look at how to build some simple percussive sounds in VCV Rack. Okay, so here we are in VCV Rack, and I've got a clock module here on the left, and that main clock is going to trigger this envelope generator, which is an AD envelope. And you can see that envelope here on the scope, and you can see that envelope generator is being sent to this VCA. And what is being sent through that VCA is this oscillator here. This is a VCO2 from the fundamental modules, and its waveform is all the way to the left, so you can see it's producing a sine wave. And yeah, so that's what we're hearing right now. So let's go ahead and make this into a kick drum. We're going to start by just pitching this down. So down at 50 hertz. And then let's go ahead and give this envelope a better percussion shape. So we're going to get rid of all the attack. And let's go ahead and lose a little bit of that decay. You can see over here the clock is moving quicker than the envelope that we're hearing, and that's because the decay is continuing so long that it's missing every other click here, every other click of the clock. So if we slow that decay down even more, Now every trigger from the clock here is moving through, and it's producing this bass drum sound. And so now what we want to do is take this envelope and apply it to the pitch of this oscillator. So you can see I'm sending the envelope from the envelope generator into the FM input on this oscillator. And so now as I bring this FM CV up, you'll hear that pitch envelope start. At first it'll be quite subtle. So this is already a pretty good bass drum sound. Let's just see what happens if we move it higher and higher. So this starts to sound pretty artificial, but this is a sound that we're used to hearing in some electronic dance music, these really punchy bass drum sounds. And here we get to where it's maybe a little bit too high to be useful to us. And then up that high, it sounds like a laser gun. So let's move it back to where it sounds a little more realistic. And so this gives us our tone, but now over here, I've got a couple modules which will give us the noise aspect of our sound, the noise of when the pedal hits the bass drum. So I've got a noise generator here, and I'm sending white noise into a low pass filter, and I'm sending that signal through a VCA, which is then going into this little UMix mixer, which is going down to my main mixer down there. Let's go ahead and bring this up and we'll hear. And so we've already got a pretty good envelope here. We want our noise to fade out a little quicker than our tone. So right now our decay on our tone is 0.45 seconds, and this is 0.41. So let's make it even shorter. There we go. Now we just get a little click at the very beginning. We'll close the filter some. And maybe even bring that level down a little bit. Now, before we move on, I'll point out that some people like to use something other than sine waves for their kick drums. So we can open the waveform a little bit to where it looks more like a triangle wave. That gives us a few more overtones and a slightly richer sound. And so generally with kick drums, people are using something between a sine wave or a triangle wave. You rarely will hear people go all the way over to sawtooth waves. But generally one of these relatively light in overtone waveforms is preferable. All right, so now let's go down here, and I'm taking another clock from my clock generator, the divided by 2 clock, which is coming out clock 1 here. And you'll see that's coming down to this noise generator. And I've got this noise generator moving through a filter, moving through Volt's Spank drum envelope, which is an AHD envelope. And I've got this envelope running into the scope so we can see it. And then that's going into my mixer here. So let's unmute that. We just hear these clicks for right now. But we're going to turn this into a snare drum. So let's start by tweaking our envelope here. So I'm going to increase the decay first. You can see that on the scope. So we've got a nice decay. Any more decay than this might sound kind of fake. But it still isn't quite as punchy as a snare drum is. So we can increase this hold time. And that's sounding a little better, a little more like a snare drum. So one thing you'll notice about Spank is that it is an envelope generator, but it's got a built-in VCA. So we don't have to add an external VCA like we did up here with these Bog Audio AD envelope generators. So down here we've got a built-in VCA. So we send our incoming signal into the input, the outgoing out the output. And then the only other options besides our AHD controls is down here where it says soft, hard, or loop. So a soft envelope is going to be a little bit longer. If we switch this over to hard, the envelope's going to get a lot shorter and a lot punchier. So we would want to open this up a little bit more to make it sound more like a snare drum. That's probably a little bit better for our purposes. And it's got this third option, loop. And what loop does is it actually creates, if we were to zoom in, you might be able to see this better. it creates several really quick bursts of noise, which actually is designed to work specifically with snare drum sounds. It could also work well for hand claps and things like that. So before the actual decay of the envelope, you get this burst of several really quick, very quick envelopes that move the signal up and down before the actual sound fades out. So that kind of works for us. I'm going to go back to the hard envelope and we'll go for a basic drum sound for right now. And it still doesn't sound exactly like a snare drum, so I'm going to go ahead and close this filter some. Okay, that's not bad. And so our other main drum sound that we're going to be working with is a hi-hat. So up here on my clocked, I've got clock 2 moving at 2 times the speed of our bass drum. And so you can see down here, I've got almost exactly the same setup that I had up here. Noise going through a filter, going through spank. And so let's go ahead and take the same setup and make a hi-hat, because very often hi-hats, they're just like little bursts of noise that just have a narrower bandwidth. So on this filter, on our snare drum, I was using a low-pass filter. Down here, I'm using high-pass mode. So we're going to go ahead and first unmute this. Let's go ahead and open our envelope some. We're not going to need very much at all for a hi-hat. I mean, this itself is already pretty good. It's got a very quick attack and then almost instantaneous decay, but there's enough there for us to hear it. And then we're just going to close this high-pass filter. Can open our decay a little more. It sounds like the hi-hat's opening up a little bit. And now we've got a hi-hat. So we've got our hi-hat playing eighth notes, our snare drum playing half notes, and then our kick drum playing quarter notes. And we can go ahead and tweak our clock module here to get some variations. So you can see here it takes a lot of modules to make even a relatively straightforward drum sound. Like we're using, if we don't count the scopes, we're using like 6 or 7 modules here for the bass drum, and then 3 each for our hi-hat and snare. So it might be handy if there was some kind of instrument that would kind of combine some of these for us so we didn't have to build everything out. And that's what we get when we're working with a drum synth. So a drum synthesizer is a module that combines several different elements commonly used in drum synthesis into a single module. So a drum module will commonly contain an oscillator, a noise generator, an AHD envelope altogether, maybe some additional parameters as well, but definitely those 3. And there is just such a drum synthesizer in VCV Rack, and that is made by Volt, and it's called Trummer. And so here I am in VCV Rack, and I've got a clock going into Trummer. I'm sending the clock's trigger into gate, and then the output into the mixer, and that's all I need for this drum sound. So let's look a little more closely at it. So here in Trummer, I've got, there's 2 halves, an oscillator half and a noise half. And each of them have a big level knob that we can use to change their balance with each other. So I'm going to start by just isolating the tone, the oscillator side. So up here we've got a tune knob, which will set the pitch for our drum. So let's go ahead and make a kick drum, so we'll want to tune that pretty low. And then here is a knob that's going to control, it says bend, and this is going to control how deep our pitch envelope is. So if it's down close to 12 o'clock, it's going to be almost no envelope at all. If we bring it higher, it gets pretty deep. And if we actually go, let me tune this up higher. If we go below towards the negative, we get an inverted pitch envelope that actually slides up instead of down. But we don't want that for our purposes for now, so let's go with something like this. Then there's a drive knob, which will add some soft clipping. Then here we've got our envelope, attack, hold, and decay. And honestly, the settings that it's at right now kind of work just fine for us. All right, so let's mute that and go over to the noise side. And so the noise side, there's a knob that says tone. This is actually just like a filter, like a bandpass filter. And then here it says decimate. This is a bit crusher. This will add some distortion to that signal. Then we've got a separate envelope, because remember, sometimes we want to have a different envelope shape for our tone as we do for our noise. And then our level. So let's go ahead and mix these together. We definitely don't want that much noise. So maybe something like that. So yeah, and we can do all that in this one simple module. So Volt has made a second, more advanced version of Trummer called Trummer Squared. And let's go ahead and open that up. And you can see that here. It's got a lot of the same controls and a few extra ones as well. So on the oscillator side, it's added a second oscillator with some wave shaping controls. And also it's added a time knob on our bend, so we can control how long that bend, that pitch envelope is. On the noise side, it's added a bunch of filter controls. So there's a filter here. You can change which kind of filter you want. There's a resonance knob, and then there's a comb filter, which can also distort the signal. So let's go ahead and use this to make a snare drum. I've got my clock set here still, so I've got the clock that's half as fast over here in clock 1. So we're going to send that into the gate, send our output to our mixer. And let's go ahead and make a snare drum. Now we're not going to want very much tone, so let's start with our noise. Maybe make our envelope a little wider. All right, so now let's go ahead and add in a hi-hat, and that should be pretty easy. So we're going to send our ×4 clock into Trummer Squared. We'll send the output in here. So now it's playing very quickly. We'll go ahead and get rid of our tone. We're going to shorten up this envelope. Maybe make this a high pass filter. All right, so now we've got a nice little kit going with a kick drum, snare drum, and our hi-hat. And you may be realizing that this beat is not particularly interesting. It's just 4 on the floor on the kick drum, 2 and 4 on the snare, and then constant 16ths on the hi-hat. So it'd be nice if we could program something a little more interesting. And we're going to talk about that next. So with regard to drum sequencing, one thing that we have to think about is that percussion sounds rarely change pitch. So when we're sequencing drums, we don't really need control voltage. That is, we don't need a voltage that's going to go to the volts per octave input on an oscillator. We really just need the gates. So for instance, let me go ahead and set up something here in VCV Rack that just uses the gates. Open up our Seek 3 from the fundamentals. And I'm just going to send the gates here to our kick drum. So we're just getting constant gates from our sequencer. So the control voltages from the rows don't really go anywhere unless we wanted to tune our bass drum. You don't hear that very often, though occasionally you will hear some people doing like 808 style kicks where the kicks actually do play a little bit of a melody. You can hear that in some of Kanye West songs. But for our purposes, we're not going to mess with that. So we've just got this main kick here, and then we've got these gates down here at the bottom, and we can turn some of these gates on and off. To create different rhythms. And so that's kind of handy, but it's also kind of not, because this sequencer is taking up a lot of space. It's got all these different control voltages which are running. It's using up our CPU and stuff, and we're only really using the gates. So there's got to be a more efficient kind of sequencer that'll just give us the gates and not mess with any of the control voltage. And there is just such a thing. It's called a gate sequencer. And a gate sequencer is a sequencer that only sends gates and triggers, and that often allow more specific rhythmic programming. They actually will let you turn on gates and triggers kind of the way we were just doing, except it's going to do that alone and not mess with control voltage at all. So one really great gate sequencer is made by Impromptu. So we're going to go to Impromptu's sequencers and pull up this Gate Seek 64. And this Gate Seek 64 is a gate sequencer. First of all, I'm going to switch this. I'm going to right click this and change it to dark because I think this will make it be a little bit easier to see where the lights are blinking. So you can see across the top, we've got 4 groups of 4 in this top row. So we've got a total of 16 steps in this top sequence. And then we've got 4 of those, so 16, 16, 16, 16. And the way this sequencer works is it can output 4 simultaneous 16-gate sequences. So out these outputs, this will be the top row, second row, third row, fourth row. Or if we switch this switch here to where it says 4 by 16 down to 2 by 32, then the top 2 rows will make a 32-step sequence that'll come out the top gate, and the bottom 2 rows will make another 32-step sequence that'll come out the third gate. And then lastly, we can do a single 64-step sequence that's just going to play 1 row, then the next, then the next, then the next. And those are all going to come out the top gate. We're going to do the 4 by 16-step sequence, and we're going to take our clock. This needs an external clock, so we're going to send that into the clock input, and we're going to let that run our sequence, and you can see these steps ticking away. And let's go ahead and program in a little beat. So I'm going to give my kick drum the bottom row. So we'll send this bottom row to our kick. And then let's give something to our snare. And we'll send this third row to the snare. And then we'll make something for the hi-hat. And we'll send this third row, or second row, I should say, to the hi-hat. Now you notice this feels very slow. And that's because I sent my main clock here, but this sequence is moving in 16th notes, 4 by 4 by 4 by 4. So instead of sending my main clock, I should have sent my times 4 clock. So we can just jump this down here. And now we've got a really great sounding sequence here. You can see this bottom row. We've got our bass drum, which is effectively 4 on the floor, except I've got a little extra 16th at the end. Our snare is playing on 2 and 4 with a couple other additional beats in there. And then I've got a relatively quickly moving hi-hat line there at the top. Now, this is a really advanced sequencer. There's tons of functions here. We could spend a whole week just on all the stuff that this sequencer can do. So we're not going to go into all that. There's only one additional feature that I'll point out to you. You can also store a few different sequences in here. So if we go up one, you can see that I've added another little sequence in here. And so you can store up to 32 different sequences in this sequencer. So that's really, really powerful. So that's really useful, but you do still have to program in every single detail of your sequence, which honestly for a lot of people is great because you want to have that control and really program in and design your own beats. But for others that might just want to generate some beats on the fly, another useful sequencer is called Topograph by Valley. And so Valley has this sequencer called Topograph, which is a 3-channel drum sequencer. That is, it outputs 3 different channels that can go to different drums. Usually the first one goes to the bass drum, second one to the snare, third one to the hi-hat. And this creates its own drum patterns. Basically, it's got a big library of drum patterns stored into it. But rather than choosing different drum patterns like from a menu where you say, I want pattern number 1 or pattern number 16, it's got them stored in a continuous 2-dimensional map. And so this map we can move through by moving along the x-axis by turning this x knob, the y-axis by moving this y knob. So let's go ahead and connect this up and listen to some of the patterns that are stored in there. I'm going to take the trigger output from 1 and send that into the gate of my kick, trigger output from 2 and send that to my snare. And of course you could mix these up if you wanted. I'm just doing the most standard way of using this. And let's go ahead and start this. It doesn't need an external clock. It's got its own clock built in. And so you can hear this beat we've got with these knobs all the way to the left. And as we change the x-axis on our map, we start moving through some different patterns. And we can also change the y-axis and get some variations there as well. And then this chaos knob basically introduces a level of variation. So if this knob is all the way down to 0, we're just going to hear the same beat repeat over and over. And if we increase this knob, that beat will change on occasion. So then each of these knobs up here refer to the density of each channel. So this up here is channel 1 density. So that means that this is going to be how often our kick drum is playing. Right now it's in the middle, so it's playing just kind of a standard amount of time. If we want the kick drum to play more, we can increase this knob. Or less. Do the same thing with our snare. If we turn it all the way to the left, it won't play at all. And we'll vary our hi-hat as well. And then here are some fill triggers, which will add a little fill to this particular channel whenever it gets a trigger sent in. So why don't we go ahead and sync this module to our main clock up here. And then we'll take a really slow clock, like a 1 divided by 8 or divided by 4, and we'll send that into the fill on the snare drum. So that's maybe too much. Let's go ahead and divide it by a little more, like 16. And these last outputs down here are for accents. So these are going to be the stronger beats that are coming out of these trigger outputs here. So for instance, if you wanted to have another extra big bass drum that played only on the accented beats, we could add one of those and then send the output of the accent to that. And Topograph exists in a smaller, more compact version called MuGraph, which is basically all the same controls, just kind of in a smaller layout. All right, so let's transition now and start talking about the TR-808. So the TR-808, some of you may have heard of it before. It's a really famous drum machine that was produced by Roland from 1980 to 1983. Now, there were other drum machines that were produced throughout the 1970s, but a lot of those drum machines were not programmable. That is, that they might have a selected collection of beats that you could choose from, and you might be able to set their tempo and maybe choose some other modest features about the beats. But effectively, you were choosing from pre-programmed beats. And your drum machine might have a selection of 10 or 20 or maybe many more than that. But no matter what, they were always pre-programmed and you couldn't really change these pre-programmed beats. So one of the things that set the TR-808 apart was that it was programmable. It actually had a gate sequencer built into it, so you could program whenever every single drum sound was happening, and this allowed people to create their own beats with the drum machine. The other thing that set the 808 apart was that the sounds were created using analog synthesis and not pre-recorded samples. So most drum machines that were released before this relied on pre-recorded samples, a recording of a kick drum, a recording of a snare drum, and then these recordings would be grouped together and played with a sampler, so that as you're choosing from all these pre-programmed drum beats, you're choosing from these drum beats that are playing just recordings of actual acoustic drums. But the 808 is using electronically produced drum sounds, and it's not relying on samples of electronically produced drum sounds. It, in fact, was a synthesizer that was creating these sounds on the spot. So the TR in TR-808 actually stands for transistor rhythm, which refers to the fact that these rhythms are produced with actual synthesizers are components on a circuit board: transistors, capacitors, resistors, things like that. Now, while the 808 is this very storied, very popular device now, it was initially pretty unsuccessful due to the fact that these drum sounds were unrealistic. They didn't sound like actual acoustic drums. And now we think that's part of the charm of the instrument and what's cool about it, that these drums fulfilled the function of a kick drum and a snare drum and a hi-hat. But if you actually listen to them, they didn't sound like actual kick drums or snares or hi-hats. Nonetheless, it slowly over time developed this cult following in DIY dance scenes, especially early house music and hip-hop scenes, as people were using this drum machine to create that kind of music. And let's look at a couple examples. So the first piece on your listening assignment is from Africa Bambaataa, and it's called Planet Rock. And in this piece, Bambaataa uses an 808 to synthesize a hip-hop-esque breakbeat, which is used as the foundation of the piece. So rather than hearing, as you would very often hear in hip-hop of the time, you're not hearing a sample from an old funk record or anything. You're hearing a new breakbeat that's created from scratch with the 808.
It's the short shot.
This piece was really important historically. It's kind of the progenitor of the electro genre, which is a genre of dance music that's based entirely around the 808, and also uses other synthesized sounds, some of which might be samples or might be played on other small synthesizers. Here in Planet Rock, you can hear a sample from the German band Kraftwerk's song Trans Europe Express, which has this melodic synthesizer bit. So I'll play another excerpt here. You'll hear the 808 used as the backdrop, and then the melodic synth is this Kraftwerk sample.
Play, our world is free. Be what you be. It's me.
So the other piece I gave you guys to listen to is by Charanjit Singh. And this is from a record he made in 1982 called 10 Ragas to a Disco Beat. And what's significant about this record is he uses the 808 to synthesize the drum sounds. And we get some pretty different sounds than we heard in the very electro Planet Rock example. So you'll hear some claves and things like that we didn't hear in the previous example. He also used, in addition to the 808, Charanjit Singh uses TB-303, which is also made by Roland. It was sort of a complementary bass synthesizer that was relatively inexpensive and was used often in early acid house music. And what's cool about this record is that Charanjit Singh is in India at the time, and he's making this music which is kind of inspired by Indian raga practices. The bass lines and things like that you'll hear are very raga-esque, including some of the melodies and things as well. But the way that he's using them and the way that he's producing these sounds with the TV303 and the TR808, he ends up sort of stumbling on something that sounds a lot like acid house. And so you have this guy in India who's sort of creating his own acid house even before acid house is a thing in the United States. All right, so let's look at some specific 808 sounds, how they were made, and how we can recreate them. So the bass drum is probably the most famous part of the 808's sonic repertoire. It's famous for this big booming bass drum. And on the slide here, I've got not a photo of an actual 808, but a cropped photo of an 808 emulator, because it's just a little bit easier to see than trying to read from an actual photograph. So these are some of the controls that you would have to modify the different sounds on the 808. You can see each column there refers to either one or two different drums. There's a few in the middle there that you could choose between either a high conga or a high tom, or a clave or a rim shot, and there'd be a little switch that you would switch between. And then there are some columns like the bass drum, the snare drum, the cowbell, where that would just be one column devoted to a single drum. So the booming bass drum was made from just a sine wave, a low pass filter, and a VCA. And you can see there in the bass drum column, there are three knobs. Basically every column has a level knob that would control how loud that individual drum was. And then you would have different parameters that you could change for different drums. Some drums, like the cowbell, you could only change the level, and they didn't give you any other parameters to mess with. And then other drums, you have these white knobs, which would change some parameter, maybe one or two parameters, depending on the drum, that you could alter. So on the bass drum, you could change the tone, and the tone knob would move the filter. And you might think like, well, it's just a sine wave. There's not really any overtones to filter out. But there is that click at the beginning. Because there's this instantaneous attack, you'll hear that click at the downbeat, right where that drum is struck. And that click can be filtered out and made brighter or darker. And you can do that with the filter. So if you moved that tone knob on the bass drum, you would get a series of sounds that would sound like this. And then the other parameter we have on the bass drum is the decay knob. And as you change that decay, you can lengthen the envelope and let the sound be a little more resonant and ring out a little bit more. Now, one thing you'll notice about the 808's bass drum is that it doesn't really have that pitch envelope that we were talking about before. So whereas a lot of synthesized bass drum sounds have that big pitch envelope that, sometimes even makes it sound like a laser gun or something, but you don't have that on the 808. You just get this big resonant sine wavy bass drum. All right, so here we are in VCV Rack, and I've made a patch that imitates the 808 bass drum. So I've got a VCO2, the waveform is all the way to the left, so it's a sine wave. The pitch is down at 76 hertz, so it's quite low. We've got an AD envelope. Topograph is sending regular triggers in there. And there's not a lot to play with to vary. We could change the decay time. Just like we can on the 808. And then we can change the position of the filter to change how much noise we hear on that click. You have to listen real close to hear this. So the 808 kick is really, really straightforward. All right, so now let's look at the 808 snare drum. The snare drum had two different components. It was made from two sine wave VCOs, white noise, a low pass filter, and a VCA. And so these two sine tones were pitched to two different pitches. And you can see there on the slide, the snare drum had two different controls, one called tone and one called snappy. The tone knob could be changed, and this would crossfade between the two different sine waves. It would crossfade from the low sine to the high sine. And so you could get a mix of the two, or a snare drum that's pitch was relatively low or relatively high. And that would sound like this. And then there was the quote-unquote snappy parameter, and the snappy could be changed, and this is effectively a decay of the VCA, but it's not just the general VCA for the whole snare drum sound, it's the decay time on white noise in particular. So as you increase the snappy knob, you're increasing the decay of the white noise. So let's look at how to build that in VCV Rack. So here we are in a patch that I made that kind of imitates the 808's snare drum sound. Let's start by getting rid of the noise and just focusing on the pitched aspect. I've got two oscillators here. Their waveforms are all the way to the left, so they're producing sine waves. They are tuned to be an octave apart. This one's at 164, this is at 329. And they're both at about half volume. Now remember, the snare drum on the 808 had a way to crossfade between them. And so what I've done here is I've done something a little interesting. I took this dual attenuverter and I didn't plug anything into it. So there's nothing coming in for me to attenuate. So what it's doing is it's just going to send voltage if I add an offset. So if I set this to 0, it just sends 0 volts. But if I increase this offset, it can move all the way up to 10 volts. So it becomes just a little slider that's going from 0 volts to 10 volts. I can go to -10 as well if I wanted to. So remember this dual attenuverter, we talked about this a couple weeks ago. It's a dual attenuverter, meaning it's got an attenuverter up here and down here. So what I did is I took the output from the top part and just sent it in to the bottom. And so let's see what's happening on the bottom here. If I set this to 0 and my offset to 0, then whenever I change the offset on the top, nothing's going to happen to the bottom. It's always going to stay at 0. But if I invert it by moving this all the way to -1, if I invert it down that way, then whenever I increase this offset, where the top one is going to go up to 10, the bottom one's going to go down to -10. And then I can move my offset back down to 0, and they come down together in the middle. So the bottom one becomes an inversion of the top one. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase this offset on the bottom by 10. And so instead of moving from -10 to 0, the bottom one, the pink one, is going to move from +10 down to 0. So you can see now as I move this offset knob, they become inversions of each other, moving from between 0 and 10. So when one is up at 10, the other is down at 0. They kind of meet in the middle around 5. And then the other one goes up to 10, and the other one is down to 0. So what does that mean for all this over here? Well, I'm sending one of those outputs to the VCA of my first sine wave, and the bottom one goes to the VCA of my second sine wave. So if I open this up here, you can see that just moving this offset knob becomes like a crossfader. So it's things like that that I think are really cool about working in the voltage world, that you can do little simple things like that that can create handy little tools for you. So let's listen as I crossfade between these two different sine waves. So that sounds just like on the 808. I'm going to make it where we hear about as much of each of them. And that's moving through an AD envelope. And let's look down here, then I've got the noise aspect. So let's bring this up. So the other control that we have on the 808 is the snappy control, and that's basically just the decay time of the noise. So this would be with 0 snappy, and then we would increase the snappy and get a sound like that. And so that's how we can make an 808 snare drum. Okay, so next let's look at the hi-hat. So the 808 had two different hi-hat sounds, a open hi-hat and a closed hi-hat. You can see those on the two farthest right columns on the 808 down there. Both of them had a level knob, and you'll notice the closed hi-hat sound doesn't have any other parameters. So there's just a single closed hi-hat, there's nothing you can adjust on it. And then the open hi-hat sound just has a decay knob that's going to increase the decay time. So here's the closed hi-hat. And then here's the open hi-hat, and I'm going to gradually open the decay. And you notice that has a particular sound to it. It doesn't really sound just like the filtered white noise like we were using earlier. There's actually kind of a more pitchy metallic sound to it. And the way that they made the hi-hat sounds on the 808 is they took 6 inharmonically spaced pulse waves. So 6 pulse waves which were not tuned to the harmonic series but were inharmonically related to each other, all set to different pitches. And then they ran them through 2 bandpass filters with a slightly longer decay time on the higher filter. So you got these inharmonically related pulse waves which generate a lot of overtones, make it pitched and metallic and a little bit noisy, but not like super noisy. And then you use the filters to focus on a particular pair of bands, and then the higher band is going to take a little longer to ring out than the lower band. So let's look at doing that in VCV Rack. All right, so here we've got a patch where I made an 808 style hi-hat. And you can see here I've got 6 oscillators. The waveform is all the way to the right, so they're all sending out square waves. And I've got them tuned so that each one is a little higher than the next, but I didn't work very hard to like finesse them. I just kind of randomly tuned them so each one was a little higher than the next. And so because I didn't try to measure them out or make them all harmonically related to each other, they're producing this inharmonic cymbal-like sound. And if we were to mute them all, there's our lowest one. And so you can hear when they all are playing together, they have this cymbal-like quality to them. And then I'm taking the output of this mu mix module and sending that into one filter and then into another filter. And each of these filters has their own AD envelope generator, which is going into a VCA. And you can see if we were to mute one of these, that this one is a bandpass filter. And it's set to a center frequency of about 4,000 hertz, and that's what we see in the green on this spectrum analyzer down here. And the decay time on this envelope is 0.18 seconds. So then over here, I've got the higher filter. So this is another bandpass filter, only this time the cutoff frequency is 65,000 hertz. And this decay time is a little longer. It's 0.22 seconds. So we can see down here the band is a little bit higher. This is the pink one. And if we were to unmute this one, you can hear that it rings out a little longer. So we've got a low one that rings out almost as long and a high one that rings out longer. And together, they sound like that. And I added one extra variable here that we don't have on the 808. I just sent an attenuverter into the FM input on all of these pulse waves, and then opened up the FMCV a little bit, which allows us to tune these a little bit. So as I move this offset here, I can tune it and get some different hi-hat pitches. All right, and the last sound that we'll look at, there's of course plenty of other sounds on the 808, but the last one that we'll look at here is the hand clap. So the hand clap is a sound, it's meant to sound like people clapping their hands. There's no parameter there to adjust other than the level. So you can see it's the last one on the right that allows you to choose between two sounds. It's maracas on the top and the hand clap on the bottom. So you would just switch that switch down to the hand clap and then it would produce this sound. And the way that the hand clap sound was produced was from spaced pulses of noise with added reverb. So if you think about this sound is meant to imitate the sound of a crowd of people clapping their hands, and as a crowd of people claps their hands, they're all going to produce this noisy sound, but they're not all going to clap their hands at precisely the same moment. So these little bursts of noise from when we clap our hands together are going to happen close to each other, but not all at the same time. So they're using spaced pulses of noise, these really quick little pulses of noise that are happening very quickly, but are still individual from each other. And they're just going to run that through some reverb to kind of help blur it all together and give it a little bit more resonance. And so there's a couple different ways we can do this in VCV Rack. One is to use that looping option on the Volt Spank module, which we kind of talked about earlier. But rather than doing that, I'm going to do it with a burst generator. All right, so here I've got a really simple patch to do the 808 style hand clap. And let's see what's happening here. I'm going to start by disconnecting some of this stuff on the right and just send my noise through the amplifier right into my output here. So what happens is every time this thing sends a burst, it sends a couple very quick gates of white noise. And we can hear that by disconnecting that, increasing this time thing. And so right here where it says repetitions, I've got 4 repetitions. So every time I hit this burst, 5 bursts of noise. And we just want that to happen a little bit faster. So I'm going to move this time knob down, down further, even further still. So now it sounds like a machine gun or something. And instead of me clicking this button, I'm going to send the trigger output from topograph into the burst input. And so that gives us these bursts of noise. And now I'm going to send that into a filter. And this is a bandpass filter now. So I'm going to adjust this and find something that sounds kind of hand clappy. I can tweak the resonance here. And then we can send that into our plate reverb. It still sounds a little machine gunny, so I'm going to make this time even shorter. There we go. Now it sounds like a hand clap from the 808. Okay, so I made all these different copies of all these different 808 sounds, but let's see what would happen if I put them all together in the same patch. Okay, so here I've got a patch that's imitating a full 808. So here is my kick drum in the second row. Above that, I have my hand clap. Down here, I've got my snare drum with its 2 sine waves and its noise generator. And then down here is the hi-hat with all these different square waves and a couple of different bandpass filters. And then I've used a gate sequencer to program a little rhythm, and it's being controlled by this external clock. And altogether, we have this great 808 emulator that's playing this rhythm. And yeah. So to wrap up, today we talked about synthesizing percussive sounds. We looked at ADAR envelopes, talked about drum synthesizers like Volt's Trummer module, and drum sequencing like with gate sequencers or these more algorithmic sequencers like Valley's Topograph. Then we talked about the 808, went through its history, looked at a couple pieces that use the 808, and then recreated some 808 sounds in VCV Rack. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll talk to you guys later this week.